My name is John Siddorn. I'll start by introducing myself and then the panelists who are here to talk about advancing science through data. So my role at the National Oceanography Centre is as Associate Director for the Digital Ocean. And the background to this role is really understanding how we use our data to advance some of the major challenges we face as a society. Some of the issues around pollution, food security, climate challenges, they often have an ocean component or an ocean-related set of issues. And to understand the ocean elements of those issues, we really need to understand how to best use our data. And of course, the ocean is extremely remote, it's inaccessible. We'll introduce you to our panelists today who all have some form of role in gathering data from the ocean and exploring how to use it. And so our ambition as an organisation is to really increase our capability to gather more and more different types of data from the ocean through advancing the development of sensors, through using Earth observation, and through using autonomy, for example. And then the other context that we'll explore today is the fact that increasingly there's bigger and bigger data. There's more and more data being involved in science. We've got the Internet of Things concepts. We've got sensors that are churning out vast amounts of data. So it's becoming harder and harder to use it. So we're going to explore how we might adapt to the world of big data. And then, of course, we've got really complex things around computing, and many people here will really remember that, 10 years ago, smartphones were very limited in capacity. We've now got smartphones which have probably got as much capacity on them as our PCs did 10 years ago, and that evolution is continuing, although quite differently. So that's a sort of sense of the preamble. My role is to moderate the session today. Your role as an audience is to try and challenge us with questions, and I'm going to be keeping an eye out for the questions you might be sending us. But in the first instance, what I would like to do is introduce our speakers. So firstly, we have Dr. Charlotte Williams. She's a research scientist here at the National Oceanography Centre, and she's working primarily with our fleet of autonomous underwater vehicles, robots in common parlance. So what we often call them gliders. And she uses data to understand how ocean physics affects marine environmental health. So Charlotte, perhaps you can say a quick hello and introduce yourself to the audience.
Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Charlotte Williams. I'm based at the National Oceanography Centre in Liverpool, and I work with as John just said, I work with our fleet of ocean robots called gliders. Particularly interested in collecting lots of data that tells us about ocean health in terms of oxygen levels in the ocean, because that tells us about how healthy our oceans are. So.
Thank you, Charlotte. And the next panelist we have is Dr. Alexandra Kokinagi. She's a senior data scientist who works within the British Oceanographic Data Centre. And she's an expert in data management and the very, what I think weirdly termed data semantics world is where she exists. So Alex, maybe you can say hello and introduce yourself as well.
Hello, everyone. So my name is Alexandra Kokinagi. I work as Charlotte in NOC in Liverpool, and I am really passionate and enthusiastic about the semantics of the data, so that we manage to speak the same language both in our domain but in other domains as well.
Thanks, Alex. And then we have Dr. Svetlana Jevrejeva, and I promised her I'll try and say her name properly, and I failed miserably, of course. But Sveta is a sea level expert and has been involved in understanding sea level impacts, climate impacts upon sea level change, and was involved in the IPCC assessment report 5, which is a major challenge. So Sveta, over to you.
Hello, my name is Vitlana. I work for National Oceanography Center. And as John mentioned, I'm sea level scientist. Mainly, I combine observations and simulations from the model to understand sea level rise and variability, and also impact on the coast. I think we move now more to have use of our data in terms of impact on the coast. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Finally, last but not least, we have Professor Matt Mowlem, who's a principal investigator at NOC, and he's also the Chief Technology Officer at Clearwater Sensors. And his expertise is developing the sensors so that we can increasingly collect more and more diverse observations. So Matt, if you could perhaps say a few words and say hello.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm an engineer and a professional geek, I think is my full job title. And I develop new instrumentation to measure ocean waters and to try and produce headaches for everybody who has to manage environmental data. My job is to produce more and more data.
Thank you, Matt. Apologies for the chime from my computer as you were finishing there. So I'll perhaps start with you then, Matt, given that the source of the data comes from the sensors we develop, and it'd be interesting to hear a bit more about what sort of sensors you're involved in developing at the moment, what they may allow us, what they allow us at the moment to observe, and some of the challenges you have in getting ocean observations from your sensors.
So I think, first off, a confession that most data, well, a lot of data at the moment isn't collected by sensors. It's collected by samples being taken from the environment and that being analysed on a ship or in a laboratory. And that's great, and that's fantastic for getting a huge amount of very detailed information, but it's limited. There are only so many research ships in the world, and they can't be everywhere at once, and they can't really stay out for years on end to capture events when they happen, and that's why sensors are really useful. And so the sensors we're developing are to fill gaps in our ability. So there are sensors out there, you can buy sensors from very many oceanographic parameters, things like temperature and the salinity of the water, how much salt is in it. But there are not such readily available or proven sensors for a number of chemistry and biology targets. So if you want to measure ocean chemistry very precisely and in remote and hostile areas of the ocean, then we needed to develop them. So that's where I started. But we're also measuring biology using things like nucleic acids, so DNA in the water. So yeah, the sensors are designed and built to measure chemistry and biology in the remote ocean. Typically, we're trying to get them small enough so they will fit on things like the gliders that Charlotte works with. So robots that can roam the ocean measuring physics and oxygen, which of course Charlotte's very interested in, but also chemistry and biology, and try and tie that all together because it's an ocean system, ocean water, the chemistry, the biology, the oxygen and the physics all works together to produce productivity, to grow things like plankton and fish in the environment. And we're trying to fill the gap on all of that data.
Apologies, classic Zoom problem. I couldn't find my mute button. I should be experienced enough of this to be able to do that, but there we go. So you mentioned gliders, and that's a really nice segue into what I was going to ask Charlotte about, because Charlotte, you use gliders, and they're everyone's favourite toy, I suspect, at the moment. They're nice and yellow and shiny, and they go and do cool stuff. So maybe you could explain what gliders are and how you use them at the moment, and what information from them can be used for in terms of the science.
Yeah, of course. So for those who don't know about gliders, they're autonomous unmanned vehicles. That means we can drop them off in the ocean and leave them there to take measurements and then go back home. And they send messages, send information and huge amounts of data back to us. Well, they collect huge amounts and store them on the actual glider, and then they can send a tiny amount of that at a time via satellite back to us, and we can actually get the information on our smartphones now. So there's people who are working at the National Oceanography Centre on software so that we can talk to the gliders and pilot them and things from our smartphones. So the good thing about them is that they can be deployed in virtually and take measurements in virtually any environment where scientists might not normally be able to go. So or rough, like where there's rough weather or under ice conditions, also areas where there's pirates and there's piracy and things, they can take measurements. So typically all of them take measurements of temperature and salinity, which is the amount of salt in the ocean. And then they can measure things as well, like oxygen, dissolved oxygen, chlorophyll, which tells us about the tiny plants, how much tiny plants there are in the ocean, as well as the stuff that Matt's developing, the very clever sensors that can measure things like different nutrients as well, nitrate and phosphate. Yeah, so thinking that if I've missed anything. Oh, they can listen out for dolphins and whales and things as well. So there's acoustic monitors. There's all types of things that can be deployed on them, and they can send all this data back in near real time, which is really useful, because if they do get lost or something happens to them, which unfortunately sometimes does happen, it doesn't mean that we lose all of that data, that we've always got some science to work with. And we can make decisions, which I guess we'll talk about later, on the glider, where we fly the gliders, because they fly up and down through the water column based on the information that we're receiving in real time. So that's like, yeah, pretty cool.
Fantastic, thank you, Charlotte. So these yellow things are bobbing around in the ocean, and we're sort of pointing them in the direction of the things we'd like to measure, and then piping back data to the shore where we can actually sort of do some analysis on it. Fantastic. Perhaps on that point, I'll bring in Alex, to talk a little bit about some of the challenges we have around accessing data from clever instruments like the gliders, because it's obviously a big problem using that sort of autonomous information communications.
So I will say what we are doing in BODC, combining what Matt and Charlotte said. So Charlotte, with the gliders that may or may not have the fancy sensors that Matt is developing, collect the data from the sea, and then our job is to curate the data and make them available to the end users. At this point, I want you all to think how expensive the acquisition of this data is, developing the sensors, getting out to the sea. It's really expensive, but it's also really, really valuable. So the annual cost of marine data acquisition in Europe is estimated to be 1.4 billion euros. So that's the annual one. So it is important to curate them and make them available to everyone. So as soon as we receive them, our role is to archive the data in their original form, transfer them into standard formats, annotate them with the right and standardized metadata. So when Matt says we observe we create fancy measurements for sensors, we want to unambiguously know what each parameter or what each measurement means, so that it's not different with any other sensor. So we annotate them, we document them so that they are meaningful. We provide quality checking, archiving in the processed form, and then publishing to meet the needs of our end users. We are a trustable repository, and this is where people can find fit-for-purpose data from trustable repositories, and that's our job. And one final thing is that we also feed this data in bigger platforms like SeaDataNet, which is a pan-European infrastructure of all the European national oceanography centers that provide data. And all of these data are standardized so that the whole of Europe has the same standards on their data. And not only that, we also, as individuals, participate in collaborative organizations like the Research Data Alliance, where our mission is to build bridges to make data interoperable by bringing people together and finding ways forward to overcome obstacles. One more final thing is that our, and that's around the marine domain everywhere, is that our mantra is to collect once and use many times.
Thank you, yeah, and that's absolutely critical if we're going to get good value out of our data, and that's really important for us, because we're obviously very conscious of the fact that that number you gave is a huge number, and we need to get great value out of it for everyone, and not only us in the UK, of course, globally. We want to make sure that around the world people can access the data we collect. I'm not receiving very many questions, which makes me slightly anxious. I'd hope the audience is is able to hear us and to ask questions of our experts, I've just put into the Zoom link a link to the mechanism by which we can ask questions, or if you feel like putting it straight into the Zoom chat, I think that should be available as well. So anyone out there who's listening, we'd really like to hear what you think and get some feedback and some questions to the panel. So moving on to Sveta now. Sveta, we've been talking about data. You've been working in an area which, of course, is so important to society, and that's the impact of our changing climate on sea levels and understanding sea level rise into the future. Could you tell us a little bit about sea level rise, what you understand about it, and what we know now, and how the data informs our understanding of future sea level?
Thank you. I would like to pick up from Alex about importance of observations and huge value. So once it's observed, it will be used for many different kind of applications. So there is a long history of sea level observations. We do have tide gauge records, instrumental records, for something like 300 years, starting from 1700. So they are where, of course, observations were not for climate research. It most probably was for different kind of like navigation purpose or secure some kind of coastal changes. So the longest time series we have from Amsterdam, from Stockholm, and actually from Liverpool. But values, even if it just individual records, from them we understand changes in the past when we were not even considering climate change. So from later, like for the 20th century, we have observational network of tide gauges along the coast. And from that, we know that sea level rise over the last 100 years was about 20 centimeters. And the rate was about 1.3 millimeters per year. From modern data and from something to say about last 30 years, which we use satellite altimetry data in addition to tide gauges, we could say that rate is increased twice and we can see acceleration of sea level. But in the future, we are facing very different challenges, but I will not say about that now. So the current modern observation, we as well use sensors, different sensors. It could be radar, it could be pressure sensors. They have to be converted to measurements, and then data are mainly available for different applications. But as John mentioned, the hot topic now is sea level rise and protecting the assets on a coastline. I think this is mainly what I wanted to say. There is also different type of observations because impact on the coast mainly will come from extreme events. It's a different area from sea level, but it is well observed with the same sensors.
Thank you very much. The importance of sea level is fundamental, but as you say, the importance of understanding the data is really key there. So I'm hoping we're going to get some questions in. We have some people listening live now. I'd encourage you to put your questions in. I'm not sure if people have on the platform I'm looking at, which I put into the chat. So if you have put questions in and I'm not seeing them, please feel free to put them into the Zoom chat, because I really want to make sure we get some of your questions to the panel. Okay, so I'm going to go back now to Matt, because we've talked a bit about already about the things we're doing at the moment. I'd quite like to take us forward 10 years, and I'll ask this question to all the panelists in a minute. But your view is particularly important here, because you're developing sensors that will give us the eyes in the ocean in the next few years, perhaps 10 years time. So in 10 years time, what will our sensor networks look like, and what will we be able to measure, and what perhaps can we learn from those things that we can't do at the moment?
Okay, so one of the, and I'm going to introduce this now, one of the biggest challenges that's out there for ocean observation. So it's great to hear that figure from Alex about the European cost of observation. A lot of that is being spent on chips and fuel. And the problem with that is that ship fuel and ships are very inefficient in terms of emissions. Well, they certainly produce a lot of emissions. And so one of the challenges for our measurement systems is to remove carbon from the acquisition. And I think that's going to drive the future of using small robots, unstaffed platforms, drifters, buoys, moorings, and things like that, to be used much more than they are now. Now, they won't ever completely replace ships, I don't think, because ships are a very powerful way of measuring and doing experimental oceanography. But I think as we move forward into the future, and we aim to reduce our carbon emissions, I think having more sensors on more and different platforms is going to be very important. And things like gliders are fantastic. You can put them in with a small boat, a rib, very, that can even be an electric rib. It doesn't need to be fossil fuels, and they go off under battery power, and they can gather huge amounts of data. And those platform technologies are actually pretty good and fairly mature, and there are a number of people in oceanography using them. But really, at the moment, there's only a very relatively limited set of what I would say is operational proven sensors. Now, that's where we're in the Oceanography Centre and in the company that I've started. That's where we're trying to make inroads. And I think that's going to accelerate. Over the next 10 years, you will see more and more different sensors going onto these low carbon platforms, and also onto ships. So I can see sensors and robots being used to augment what a ship can go out. So if you're going to invest very heavily in carbon emissions of a ship's observation program, then adding lots of robots and sensors to that expedition would enable that to collect much more data than it would if you didn't have those extra sensors. So physical sensors, things like measuring acoustics, listening for dolphins and whales and other things, that's pretty mature, and that's very good technology. There's some issues around processing and handling the data on small platforms, but the actual sensors themselves are very good. Hydrophones are fantastically sensitive, broad range, very good. And actually the measurement of salinity and temperature, how salty is the water, how heavy is it, how dense is it, and what temperature it is. That technology is also very good. What's not so good is measuring the chemistry and biology, and that's obviously where I focused and where the teams that I work with are focused. And it's been fantastic, actually, not just our teams, but teams around the world have started to get that technology going, and it's much more robust, and it's tackling parameters that used to only be done by sampling, measuring them at least as accurately as can be done with a sample and a laboratory analysis in many instances. So things like nutrients, I think that's very robust now, and I can see in the next 10 years that will be done very widely. Nutrients will be measured. Also the carbon system, so how acidic seawater is, that's going to be done very well. There are some existing sensors for things like pH. The new sensors that we're developing are more accurate, more stable over longer time, and can go deeper and on things like on the gliders as well. So that's going to be sort of near term in the next 10 years. But I think increasingly you're going to see much more difficult things to measure being done on these small robots. Things like counting and telling what type of plankton are present in the water by perhaps using a cytometer, where you can individually count and speciate and tell what species of plankton is going through a device. I think that's going to be coming down the road. I think we will see in situ genetic analysis. Certainly we'll see in situ genetic sampling by robots, and then bringing those samples back to the laboratory. But I would also say in 10 years, we're also going to see in situ measurement with small robots. It can already be done on moorings and reasonably large platforms, but I think it's going to be possible on smaller platforms, things like gliders and floats, to measure genes that we know in advance. And we won't be doing sequencing, I don't think, on small vehicles in the next 10 years, but if we know what gene to look for, I think we can measure it in advance. And I think if you tie that together, all of those measurements with the existing very good acoustic sensing, you know, you can put pingers on fish, you can listen for biology. If we can measure genomics, the chemistry, I think we're really going to see a much more complete picture of what's going on in the ocean. And in the 10-year horizon, there will still be developments going on even then, measuring things like complex organics, pharmaceuticals, all of those things in situ in the water as well, which at the moment can only be done by sampling. It's all very technically doable, and that's why I'm very excited to be working in this area.
Thank you, Matt. And I'm pleased to say that there's a couple of questions come in. So I'm gonna come back to that 10-year horizon in a second. I'm going to ask Alex. There's a very specific question for you about how do you become a data scientist, and I don't know whether you've seen this. And do you need to be good at maths? I think I know the answer to that. I'll leave you to.
You have to. You have to love your maths. I'm not I didn't follow the full path to become data scientist. I'm an engineer as my my bachelor, and then my PhD is in medical informatics. So I see my work as looking after the health of the oceans, as I used to do to look after the health of the humans. And I fully agree with Matt on what he foresees for the sensors to be observing is actually to enhance our knowledge about the ocean anatomy, about the ocean health, to be able to cater better for the health of the oceans. But definitely read your maths.
Thank you. We've got a couple more questions, and I'm going to ask Charlotte the 100-year question, because that's a challenge. But I think where are they going to be? So our grandchildren, what are they going to be doing in oceanography, and how do you foresee that happening? It's a very challenging outlook. But if we look back 100 years, I guess we could imagine Fridtjof Nansen, people like that, sticking CTD, or sorry, not CTD, but sort of bottles over the side of the ships and then measuring the temperature in buckets and so on. So we've come a long way since then. What's the next step change in the next century?
Oh, so I definitely think there'll be, in terms of, because we're already starting to use kind of like artificial intelligence, practicing using things like that with although the gliders and the robots need to be piloted by a human pilot at the moment, they have to be. We've already practiced doing some work where we use model simulations to predict where, say, a phytoplankton bloom is going to be in the English Channel and fly the glider there. But the information has been passed to a human pilot and then passed to the glider. In 100 years, I think there'll be a combination of computer simulation, large computer simulations, satellite information fed into those that directs fleets of ocean robots, which are collecting all of these kinds of measurements and with these intelligent sensors that Matt mentioned before. And all of this data is being assimilated all together to predict and forecast things. Yeah, I guess more artificial intelligence.
There we go. You can maybe explain what artificial intelligence is in a minute. But well, no, explain. Go away now. Go ahead now.
Oh, so what do you say? Computer and machine-based decisions that are similar to a human decision, making decisions based on their own, basically. Yeah. Computers making decisions on their own without human input. So
doing the things that we could do, but perhaps don't have the time to do, like images and so on.
Yeah, so automatically, and I think drones might be involved in that as well. So there'll be perhaps, instead of having to go out on ships and things to deploy different instruments, and that we might be able to do those with drones in 100 years. Yeah, sorry, Matt's going to say something.
I think he's going to agree with the drones bit.
Yeah, I think I neglected it in my answer, and it's very true, actually. Artificial intelligence is making really big inroads in things like the analysis of images. And that can be images taken by, you know, a microscope looking at water, and that could be in situ, it can be in the lab. You know, looking at tiny plankton, both animals, zooplankton and phytoplankton. But increasingly also it's used for processing benthic images. So I'm working with brilliant colleagues in one of my European projects, Tech Oceans, where the teams are looking at pelagic in the water column and benthic on the seabed images, and using artificial intelligence to characterize them and say what's in that image, so that a human expert doesn't have to look at every single one, which is so time consuming it just can't be done. A single vehicle can fly over many hundreds of square kilometers of seabed taking images, and to use artificial intelligence that can perceive what those images are about and classify them can save a lot of human effort. So yes, I think artificial intelligence, that's just an example, but very, very good at looking at data and extracting the information that we might want. One of the nice things that that team is doing, so this is Blair Thornton and others at the University of Southampton, they're using artificial intelligence to look at all of these benthic images, and then rather than trying to transmit many gigabytes of video or images from the seabed over a satellite link, which basically can't happen or would be very expensive, the artificial intelligence is saying what's in those images, and instead of sending the picture of a crab, it will say there are this many crabs in that image, and that's a huge compression of how much data needs to be transmitted. So I think artificial intelligence will have a big role to play in interpreting data from the ocean, but also enabling it to be transmitted, or the important information from the data to be transmitted in real time so people can act on it.
Thank you, Matt. And I wanted to bring in another tool that we have in our armory, because observations are only one part of how we generate knowledge. And I wanted to bring Sveta in on the modeling side. So how does modeling help us understand the observations and turn that into information we can usefully use as scientists?
Yep, thanks. A scientific community, we use observations mainly to make estimates of, for example, about sea level rise, what happened in the past, but also to understand the main physical mechanism for those changes. And then it transferred to the models to make projections and predictions. So we try to simulate changes in the sea level for short term. It is mainly to extremes associated with propagation of tropical cyclones or typhoons or hurricanes. But on a long term, for 100 years and beyond 100 years, we use climate models to project what happened with sea level. As I mentioned, from observations, we know that for the 20th century, we had about 15-20 centimeters sea level rise. And from media, you heard quite a lot of information about coastal inundation and so on, and it was just 20 centimeters plus extreme events. Well, by the end of 21st century, the kind of like worst case scenario, it's up to 2 meters sea level rise. So we are facing unprecedented challenges, how to, first of all, to model, simulate sea level, but also I think the main challenge, and that's where we definitely need artificial intelligence, it is about how to communicate our results to policymakers, decision makers, general public. So I think in a scientific community, we do have knowledge about what happened with ocean, with ice sheet, and other contributors to sea level rise. We do have understanding about extremes and how they could change in future. But UK itself, at the moment, we have 500,000 properties on a coast at the risk of coastal inundation. We have roads, we have railways along the coastline. We have to think how we're going to protect those assets in the future. And that future not only by 2100. And there is a huge difficulty how we could communicate what we know and our uncertainty and what we think we are missing or something like that to policymakers and engineers, coastal engineers and other people taking care of our coastline. I think this is an exciting time for these digital twins. If we could, if we could combine.
I was about to call digital twins, so that's perfect. Thank you.
I was about to do the same.
Yeah, but I think this is honestly the huge step forward if we could have tools which we could provide for policymakers and decision makers, when we could simulate different realities and demonstrate what would happen with our projections and their decisions, and also other components of the decision making. I think I think it is exciting time, and I'm sure that in a few years we will be in completely different stage for communicating future changes to different part of society.
Yeah, it's a fantastic opportunity, I think, isn't it? You're right. Hey, Alex, maybe you could, Alexandra, maybe you could explain to the audience a little bit about what a digital twin is and how it can achieve that ambition. And then I have a couple of questions that I'd like to come back to. So
exactly, because they're coming from different channels, so they are there. Yeah. So actually, while Svetlana was talking, I could picture more and more the digital twins as a solution to the challenges that that domain, the coastal and the sea level domain, is facing, but not only that. So a lot of talk has been created around the digital twins, which are actually the virtual representation of the digital counterpart of a physical object or process, or for example, just have a ship and the virtual twin of a ship, or a wind turbine and its virtual representation. To enable this digital twin, you need data, historical data, real-time data, and forecast data, but also simulations and models. For real-time predictions, optimization, monitoring, controlling, and improved decision-making. The most important thing that you can do with digital twins is run what-if scenarios. For the warriors, these what-if scenarios in the digital twins that can stretch them, bend them, break them, and not break the physical twin is what it can give you. It can help you predict catastrophic events before they happen and communicate them to save lives. Predict the effects of climate change. But one of the most important ones that can also happen with digital twins is that because they provide visualization and easy to use and friendly, user-friendly interfaces, they can bring together different audiences and different stakeholders, like policymakers, like citizens, scientists, ocean scientists, but also consider that what we want to have as an end goal is a web of digital twins. So not only the digital twin of the ocean, for example, but the digital twin of the ocean and the atmosphere and the land, but also the digital twin of the human. So each one of us can have a virtual representation of us. And this started off it's an old concept starting 2002. And it started from the industry where they wanted to test, for example, a car, how far can I stretch its capabilities without actually breaking it. It can also bring us all together as audiences, as stakeholders, and be able to communicate the issues and the problems that we are having in the environmental domain in an easier and more collecting way.
So maybe I can try and do a bit of a brief summary of some of the things we've heard now. We've heard from Matt about the sort of the really amazing range of different things we might be able to measure in the future. We've heard from Charlotte about a sort of 100-year vision where autonomy and AI and a sort of Internet of Things type approach to ocean measurement can come together. And then we've heard from you, Alex, about how you bring that together into a representation of the environment we're in, but also the interaction with humans into a digital twin. And then from Sveta, we've heard about how we can use that information much better than we have at the moment in terms of understanding things like sea level. So I think we really are at a point in oceanography where things are transforming to really change the way we do things, and I think this digital element is a really important part of that, the data element. Anyway, we have a few more minutes, and I have 2 questions, so I'm going to ask the audience to ask the panelists to look at 2 questions. And maybe Charlotte, I don't know if you know the answer to this question that's in the Q&A channel around what the lack of data from depth below 1,000 meters, and what are we doing at the moment, and what can we do in the future to improve deep ocean measurements?
So as a coastal, I work in the coastal ocean process group.
That
Right.
was a bit unfair. Maybe someone else wants to bring that in.
I mean, I know in terms of the Argo floats that they are, I mean, Alex can probably say a bit more about this. So there's quite, I don't know how many there are deployed at the moment. It's quite a lot, and they can go to, is it 6,000 meters, Alex? 2.
I think it's 2.
2,000 meters.
Or the ones that look like the spherical ones that
the new one, yeah. I knew about the 2,000 meters. Like,
the deep Argo go to 6,000.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, they're a new.
Yeah. That's the ones I'm thinking of. So I think, and there's, I think there's deep gliders that have been developed as well. And I mean, AutoSub can go to 6,000. Is that right? Yeah.
I think Matt's really the man for AutoSub, aren't you?
Yeah.
Yes. So yeah, I mean,
that collects quite a bit of data.
And you're right, there have been deep gliders developed, and so there are platforms that can get you there, and some of the sensors are able to get to that depth. It's quite a challenge for a number of the sensor systems actually working at those depths. So there are some special things that have to be done to even otherwise standard sensors like conductivity, temperature, and depth sensing to get them to work at those extreme depths. But I have a nice result from some testing that colleagues of mine, Alison Schapp, working with Ronnie Good's group, have just been doing some extreme pressure testing on some of the componentry that we've been using in our sensors. So they've been going to really deep, beyond 6,000, which is what most things cope with, and up to 10,000.
I'm going to have to cut in now, Max. I believe we're going to be cut off firmly at 17:45. So so I think the answer to that question is we have lots of plans to do stuff more deeply, and
yes,
but there are challenges.
Yeah.
I wanted to just quickly touch on the UN Decade question that's in the chat there. I think there are lots of activities around the Ocean Decade which will help data sharing, and certainly things that the Goose community are doing around co-design and co-development of observing is really important here, but also the digital twins work, which is about data sharing. But I could rant on all day about those things, but unfortunately we are basically out of time. So what I'm going to say is thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you to the audience who submitted questions. I hope that was helpful. I'm sure there are many of you who want to engage more with NOC and our plans around data and the digital elements in the future. So I hope this is an opportunity for people to feel inspired about what we're doing, feel inspired about the future of oceanography. And we look forward to hearing from people if they've got any comments they want to take further. So I think unless any of the panelists have got a quick additional note to make, I think we will draw it to a close. Thank you, everyone, and thank you to the excellent panelists.
Thank you all. Thanks.
Thank you.
Enjoy the World Ocean Day +2.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.